Margaret Hanley spent 58 years believing she knew her husband, Walter, a devoted veteran, a loving father, and a respected pillar of their quiet town. But everything changed the day construction workers uncovered something buried beneath their basement floor. A secret so dark it shattered her world and exposed a hidden life of unimaginable horror. For nearly 6 decades, Margaret and Walter Hanley were the definition of a perfect couple. They lived in a modest but well-kept 2-story home in Maple Glen, Pennsylvania, a quiet, tree-lined suburb where neighbors knew each other by name and rarely locked their doors. Margaret was the kind of woman who baked cookies for new residents and sent handwritten holiday cards each December. Walter, a decorated Army veteran, was known for his firm handshake, his deep voice, and the way he stood a little straighter than most men his age. They'd married in 1967, raised 3 children, and celebrated their golden anniversary surrounded by friends, family, and an outpouring of love. There were framed photos lining the hallway of their home, military medals, family reunions, school graduations. It all painted a picture of warmth, loyalty, and a love that had stood the test of time. Their neighbors often said that if any couple had it all figured out, it was the Hanley. Walter was respected and well-liked, often called upon to speak at community events or lay wreaths on Memorial Day. He volunteered at the local American Legion and still wore his uniform on Veterans Day. Margaret spent her time teaching Sunday school and tending to her flower beds, always smiling, always kind. The two of them seemed inseparable, often seen walking hand in hand through the neighborhood or sitting together on the porch during warm summer evenings. No one ever questioned their story because it seemed so solid, so genuine. Beneath the surface, though, were small oddities that people overlooked, things that didn't seem important at the time. Walter never spoke about his childhood or his family. Margaret once said he told her both his hens had died in a car crash when he was young, and he preferred not to talk about it. He didn't have any siblings, no old friends from before his military service, and no photos of himself before the age of 22. Still, no one pressed him for more. He was quiet, sometimes withdrawn, but always kind, and that was enough. In 2025, Margaret decided it was time to renovate the basement. For years, water damage had caused cracks in the foundation, and the concrete was starting to buckle. Walter had always put it off, saying it wasn't a priority. But now in her 70s, and recently widowed after Walter's death from a sudden illness, Margaret wanted to sell the house and move closer to her daughter in Vermont. She hired a local contracting crew to begin work, and demolition started the following Monday. What happened next was nothing short of a nightmare. 2 days into the job, the workers broke through a section of the basement floor and hit something strange, hard, brittle, and white. At first they thought it was an old tree root, or maybe animal remains. But as more of the concrete was pulled away, it became horrifyingly clear they had uncovered part of a human skull. The police were called immediately, the house was sealed off, and just like that, the storybook life Margaret thought she had lived began to unravel, revealing a terrifying truth buried beneath her feet. The discovery of human remains beneath the basement floor sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Maple Glen. The police arrived within the hour, cordoning off the property with yellow tape as neighbors stood outside, whispering and watching. What had started as a routine renovation had now become a potential crime scene. Margaret, visibly shaken, was escorted outside by officers and taken to a neighbor's home, while investigators began their preliminary examination of the site. She had no answers, only questions she couldn't begin to understand. For over half a century she had lived in that house, trusted the man she shared it with, and now the floor beneath their lives had literally cracked open. At first, authorities treated the situation with caution. Old homes sometimes revealed strange artifacts, unmarked graves, animal bones mistaken for human. But once the forensic team arrived, they confirmed the worst. The skull was indeed human, and it wasn't alone. Several more bone fragments were found scattered around the same area. The placement and condition of the remains suggested they had been deliberately buried and then sealed under a thick layer of concrete, likely years if not decades ago. Local police quickly handed the investigation over to the FBI. It was clear this wasn't an accidental death or a recent crime. The methods used to conceal the body hinted at something more complex, more deliberate. With federal investigators involved, Margaret was once again questioned. She insisted she had no idea anything had ever been buried beneath the house. She seemed just as horrified as everyone else, but agents couldn't afford to take anything at face value. Every inch of the property was treated as potential evidence. The basement became the focus of the investigation. Specialized teams arrived with ground-penetrating radar equipment. They began scanning the entire foundation for anomalies, shifts in the soil, unexpected cavities, changes in concrete thickness. What they found was deeply disturbing. There were multiple areas beneath the slab that appeared irregular, almost as if the floor had been broken up and re-poured several times over the years. Each suspicious patch was carefully marked, photographed, and then excavated. Day by day, more remains surfaced. Word of the case spread beyond Maple Glen. Reporters from Philadelphia and even national outlets began arriving. News vans lined the street. Headlines began to speculate about a serial killer hiding in plain sight, but those closest to the Hanleys refused to believe it. How could Walter, the quiet war veteran, the loving father and grandfather, be involved in something like this? It didn't make sense. As the FBI continued their excavation, Margaret found herself caught between disbelief and dread. She replayed memories over and over in her mind, wondering if she had missed something, some clue, some sign, but nothing came. Walter had always been gentle with her, always steady, always safe, and yet beneath the floor he walked on every day, something monstrous had been concealed for years. And the worst part, they were just getting started. As the investigation deepened, the peaceful image of Walter Hanley began to fracture. People who had once spoken of him with admiration now struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the possibility of something far darker. The FBI worked around the clock, carefully excavating the basement while building a profile on Walter. What they found only added to the mystery. Despite living in Maple Glen for nearly 6 decades, Walter left behind very little documentation about his early life. There were no photos of his parents, no childhood friends who came to visit, no distant relatives ever mentioned in passing. His story, always vaguely told, began with his military service in the early 1960s, and even that, investigators would soon discover, wasn't entirely what it seemed. Neighbors described Walter as polite but private. He was helpful when asked, but never overly involved. People liked him, but no one felt close to him. It wasn't unusual in a quiet town like Maple Glen for people to keep to themselves, and Walter's military background seemed to explain his reserved nature. He was often seen wearing his army cap while gardening, attending Veterans Day ceremonies, and occasionally speaking at local schools about service and sacrifice. No one ever questioned his past because on the surface it appeared admirable. He was the kind of man who held doors open, remembered birthdays, and always paid his bills on time. But the FBI wasn't interested in the Walter everyone thought they knew. They were interested in who he really was and what he had done. The remains found in the basement showed clear signs of trauma. Forensic specialists confirmed that the victims hadn't died naturally. Most had suffered blunt force injuries to the head, and at least one showed signs of having been restrained. Even more chilling, the bones appeared to belong to different people, buried at different times. This wasn't a single tragic incident. It was a pattern. Cadaver dogs brought in to search the rest of the house reacted strongly, not just in the basement, but also near an old storage room beneath the stairs. Investigators found soil disturbance there as well. More digging revealed additional fragments, smaller, older, degraded by time. Each new discovery raised more questions. How many victims were there? Who were they? And why had no one noticed anything strange all these years? The FBI began reaching out to missing persons databases across multiple states. They also began a full background check into Walter's life before Maple Glen. What little they had led them to dead ends. His army records showed enlistment in 1962, but nothing prior. No school records, no employment history, no census data. He had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, just before the Vietnam War. That fact alone was enough to raise alarm bells. Back at the house, Margaret watched everything unfold with numb disbelief. She answered questions when asked, but spoke little otherwise. Her world, once so stable and ordinary, was now filled with strangers in suits, whispering about evidence bags and timelines. The man she had slept beside for 58 years was becoming unrecognizable. And as the truth slowly surfaced, it became clear that the real Walter Hanley was someone no one had ever truly known. The basement excavation took on the feel of an archaeological dig, but instead of artifacts, the FBI unearthed horror. As each day passed, more bones were pulled from the soil beneath the Hanley home. The remains were fragmented, brittle and aged, some wrapped in deteriorated fabric, others accompanied by rusted personal items like buttons, belt buckles, and bits of jewelry. It didn't take long for investigators to conclude that this was not one grave, it was a burial site, possibly spanning decades. Forensic analysts began the painstaking task of cataloging and dating each discovery, working to determine how many victims had been buried and when. Early estimates suggested at least 4 separate individuals, each placed in different locations under the floor, covered in lime and sealed beneath poured concrete. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide them. The burial method was cold, clinical and careful. This wasn't the work of someone who panicked. It was methodical, calculated, done over time, with purpose. The wounds on the remains told a grim story: multiple skull fractures, broken ribs, and clear signs of blunt force trauma. Some bones bore knife marks, others had been cleanly broken, perhaps to make burial easier. Most disturbingly, the hands were missing from every skeleton, whether they had been removed to prevent fingerprint identification, or for some darker reason, no one could say. But the pattern was unmistakable, and it spoke to someone who had killed before, and had likely intended to kill again. As the investigation progressed, a psychological profile of the perpetrator began to form. Whoever had done this had kept a normal life on the surface. They had maintained control. They had likely blended into their community and avoided suspicion for years, if not decades. All signs pointed to Walter Hanley, and yet nothing in his known history suggested violence. There were no police reports, no records of domestic issues, no signs of abuse or criminal behavior. His military career, on paper, was honorable. His neighbors still struggled to comprehend what was happening. Could a man known for handing out candy to neighborhood kids on Halloween really be capable of something this monstrous? Margaret was questioned again, this time in more detail. She explained how Walter had always discouraged renovations to the basement. He said it was structurally unstable, too expensive to fix, not worth the trouble. At the time it seemed like typical stubbornness. Now it felt like something else entirely, like a warning she had ignored. She remembered once hearing strange noises beneath the floor during a storm, but Walter dismissed it as shifting pipes. She never thought twice about it. Looking back, there were moments that seemed unusual. Walter's late-night walks, locked drawers in his workshop, boxes he insisted on carrying himself, but none of it had ever suggested this. Outside the home, the media presence grew. News vans lined the street, and camera crews recorded every movement of the FBI. Maple Glen, once a sleepy town few had heard of, was now at the center of a national mystery. Inside the Hanley home, decades of silence were being broken, one layer at a time, and beneath it all, the bodies kept surfacing, each one pushing the truth closer to the surface, each one whispering a story Walter had taken great care to bear. As the case gained national attention, the FBI shifted focus to Walter Hanley's identity. With 4 confirmed victims now recovered from beneath the basement, agents needed to understand who this man really was, and it was becoming more apparent by the day that Walter Hanley may have only been a name, one that masked something far more disturbing. When agents dug deeper into official records, they found an unnerving hole. Walter's life appeared to begin in 1962, when he enlisted in the U.S. Before that there was nothing, no social security records, no school transcripts, no childhood address, no trace of a family. It was as though he had stepped out of the fog and into the military system, fully formed and with a new name. This kind of erasure doesn't happen by accident. The FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services Division began running Walter's fingerprints against older databases, including those from pre-digital archives. Weeks passed with no match. Then finally, a hit came back. A set of fingerprints from an unsolved case in Indiana in 1957 matched those of Walter Hanley. Only at the time, the prints belonged to someone named Charles Emery Doyle. Doyle had been arrested on suspicion of theft, but released due to lack of evidence under assumed name. Between 1954 and 1958, he was questioned multiple times in relation to missing persons cases, though never charged. One involved a motel clerk who vanished during a stormy night shift. Another involved a teenage hitchhiker last seen getting into a car that matched a vehicle Doyle had been driving. Both cases went cold, but those details now re-emerged under a grim new light. Back in Maple Glen, the news stunned Margaret. She had never heard the name Charles Doyle before. She had never suspected her husband of anything other than being a quiet, private man. When she saw the old mugshot released by the FBI, she struggled to recognize the young man in the photo. The eyes were the same, but the face was harder, unshaped by the decades of kindness she thought she had known. The betrayal was total. The man she had loved, raised a family with, and grown old beside was not who he claimed to be. With this new identity confirmed, investigators were able to trace Doyle's movements across several states between. He had no stable residence, but wherever he stayed, a pattern of disappearances followed. The basement victims might only have been the final chapter in a longer hidden trail of violence. The life Walter Hanley built in Pennsylvania was just a cover, quiet, respectable, and carefully constructed. But it was built on lies, sealed in concrete, and eventually, like everything buried, it had started to rot its way back to the surface. With the truth about Walter Hanley's real identity exposed, the investigation took on a new urgency. Now that agents knew he was actually Charles Emery Doyle, they began working backward, trying to map his movements before night. The evidence suggested a deliberate attempt to vanish from his past life, but his trail, though faint, was still there. Records from Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois showed a man constantly on the move, changing jobs frequently, never staying long enough to plant roots. In many towns he used aliases, or gave false information, but the more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became. His path was dotted with disappearances. One of the earliest victims linked to Doyle was Diane Mercer, a 19-year-old college student in Illinois who volunteered for a summer youth program. She vanished after a staff party, her car found abandoned near a bridge. Doyle had briefly worked maintenance at the same community center that summer. At the time he claimed to have moved on to another job, and no one followed up. Her case remained unsolved for nearly 70 years. Dental records confirmed that Diane's remains were among those found in the Hanley's basement. The connection was undeniable. Other victims proved harder to identify. Two sets of remains appeared to be male transients, possibly in their 30s or 40s, dating back to the late. One carried a rusted keychain from a local bus station, the other wore a belt buckle popular with truckers at the time. Both had signs of trauma, and both had been buried in opposite corners of the basement. The differences in burial times and positioning indicated they were killed years apart. Yet each was methodically dismembered in the same way, with their hands removed, and no trace of personal documentation left behind. The final victim, later confirmed through DNA testing, was a man named Carl Dudley, a handyman from a nearby town who went missing in 1984 after answering a local ad for construction help. Records showed he'd taken a job with a retired veteran in Maple Glen. That ad, investigators now knew, was placed by Walter. No one had ever questioned it. Dudley had no family nearby, and was assumed to have left town, but like the others, he hadn't left. He'd been buried beneath the floor. The FBI now had 4 confirmed victims, spanning nearly 30 years, all connected by time, place, and method. But what chilled agents most was the gap between them. Years often passed between killings, long stretches where Doyle, posing as Hanley, lived as a model citizen. He attended church, coached Little League, and showed up at every school recital. He didn't hide from the world, he blended in perfectly. That control, that patience, is what defined him. He wasn't reckless, he was careful, cold, and deliberate. Margaret was left reeling. Each new victim added weight to the realization that her life had been built on a lie. Her memories, once filled with warmth, now felt corrupted by what had been happening in secret beneath her home. With each discovery, the man she loved disappeared further into the shadows, replaced by someone she had never truly known. With a clearer picture of the victims and a timeline forming, the FBI turned its focus to Walter Hanley's military service. For decades, he had been known as a decorated veteran, proudly wearing his medals at community events and speaking at high school assemblies about sacrifice and honor. But now, every part of his story was under scrutiny. Investigators obtained his military files, and what they found raised serious questions. While it was true that he had served in the U.S. Army during the early 1960s, many of the claims he had made over the years didn't match the official record. Walter had long said he served in Vietnam, and had been awarded the Purple Heart for injuries sustained in combat. In reality, he had never been deployed overseas. His injury, a broken leg, occurred during a non-combat training accident at Fort Dix. He received the Purple Heart under technical criteria, but it wasn't tied to valor under fire. There were no combat medals, no commendations for bravery. He had spent most of his enlistment in logistics and supply. The details he had so often shared at community events, the jungle patrols, the ambush, the rescue, were fabrications. He had crafted a war hero's image from bits of truth and elaborate lies, and he had done it convincing. Even more troubling were notes included in a psychological evaluation from 1969, just a year before his discharge. A military psychologist had flagged Hanley, then known only to the army as Walter, as emotionally detached, with signs of antisocial behavior and a lack of empathy. He had failed 2 mental health screenings over the course of his service, and there was mention of an incident involving a civilian, though details were redacted. Ultimately he was honorably discharged, but the underlying concerns were never formally addressed. It was the end of his military career, but only the beginning of the life he would build in Maple Glen. Once discharged, Hanley returned to Pennsylvania, married Margaret, and slipped seamlessly into small-town life. The new identity he had built was complete. He used his veteran status to earn trust and respect. He joined local veterans organizations, volunteered at memorial services, and was even recognized by the town council in the early 2000s for lifelong service and integrity. He was seen as a man who had given everything for his country and come home to build a peaceful life. No one ever questioned his stories. No one ever asked for proof. His uniform, medals, and confident storytelling were all people needed to believe. For investigators, the contrast between Hanley's public image and the reality they were uncovering was staggering. The facade had been airtight for decades. The real Walter Charles Doyle had exploited every institution that gave him credibility: the military, the community, his family. He didn't just lie to conceal a dark past. He built an entire false life to keep killing hidden. He had created a shield of respectability that made him untouchable, and for nearly 60 years, it had worked. But now, with each file, each record, each unearthed secret, that shield was crumbling. The basement of the Hanley home, once just a place for holiday decorations and old furniture, had become the central focus of a major federal investigation. After weeks of careful excavation, the FBI confirmed that all 4 bodies found beneath the foundation had been buried at different times over the span of nearly 3 decades. Each had been deliberately placed, their graves spaced apart in a way that suggested both planning and patience. Investigators noted the chilling precision. The placement wasn't random, it was systematic. Whoever did this knew exactly what he was doing, and he had done it more than once. By this point all 4 victims had been identified: Diane Mercer, the college volunteer who disappeared in the 1950s, Carl Dudley, the handyman who vanished in 1984, and 2 unidentified men believed to be drifters or hitchhikers who went missing in the late 90s. Forensic anthropologists estimated their ages, causes of death, and time of burial with remarkable accuracy. Despite the decades underground, enough physical evidence remained to tie their deaths to blunt force trauma, likely from the same type of object, a heavy flat instrument, consistent with a carpenter's hammer or crowbar. Traces of lime in the soil suggested an attempt to speed up decomposition, a technique sometimes used by killers to obscure time of death. Yet Doyle, living as Hanley, had also taken the extra step of sealing each burial site under new layers of concrete. This made the bodies nearly impossible to detect without full demolition, something he had avoided by continually postponing repairs and discouraging any changes to the basement. His control extended even to the layout of his home. He had built his life literally on top of his crime. Each new detail added to the growing psychological profile of the killer. He wasn't impulsive, he didn't act out of sudden rage, he was methodical, organized, and frighteningly composed. Investigators believed the long gaps between murders weren't accidental. Doyle likely selected his victims based on availability and vulnerability. 2 of them had no next of kin. One was presumed to have left town voluntarily. Another, Diane, was thought to have run away. In each case, the story fit the assumptions people already had. No one ever looked too closely. Margaret, once the heart of the Hanley household, now lived in a blur of grief and disbelief. The more she learned, the more surreal her life became. She remembered Walter spending time in the basement, saying he was working on repairs or checking for leaks. She'd never questioned it. He was always calm, always in control. It never crossed her mind that he might be using that time to cover up something so gruesome. Now the images in her memory were distorted. The warmth of her home had turned cold. Every moment, every shared laugh, was under suspicion. She wondered how many of those times were real and how many had been part of his performance. As the evidence mounted, the image of Walter Hunley, the veteran, the neighbor, the husband, shattered completely. What remained was Charles Doyle, a man who used charm as a weapon, and built a life not despite the murders, but around them. The basement was no longer just a part of the house, it was the foundation of the lie. With the weight of mounting evidence, the FBI prepared to take the next step, making an arrest. But there was a problem. Walter Hunley, Charles Emery Doyle, had not been seen in days. His absence was unlike him. For years he had followed a rigid routine. Early morning walks, afternoons tending the garden, evenings reading by the fireplace. Now the quiet rhythm of his life was broken. Neighbors reported seeing no sign of him, no car in the driveway, no movement in the house. It was as if he had vanished the moment the truth came crashing down. Investigators launched a search, coordinating with local police and federal agents, to track his possible whereabouts. They scoured his known haunts, checked with friends and relatives, and examined financial records. There were no recent withdrawals, no new credit card activity, no hotel stays under his name or any known aliases. It was as if he had planned for this moment all along. For decades he had hidden in plain sight. Now he seemed determined to disappear once more. Inside the house, forensic teams continued their work. They found detailed journals hidden in a locked drawer, handwritten pages chronicling Walter's thoughts, plans, and dark obsessions. The journals revealed a chilling glimpse into his mind. He wrote about his victims in clinical terms, almost as if cataloging specimens. There was no remorse, only cold calculation. He described each murder with meticulous detail, noting the methods used to ensure the bodies remained undiscovered. He expressed paranoia about being found out, yet his writing suggested he believed himself clever enough to evade capture indefinitely. One entry stood out. It was dated just weeks before the discovery of the remains. In it, Walter wrote about the end of the old life, and the beginning of freedom. The words hinted at an escape plan, a break from the past, that had finally caught up with him. He spoke of walking into the shadows, and leaving no trace behind. Investigators interpreted this as his intention to vanish, and avoid prosecution. Margaret, meanwhile, was left to grapple with the aftermath. With Walter gone, she faced a future shaped by betrayal and sorrow. The house they shared, once her sanctuary, had become a grim reminder of the horrors hidden beneath. Community members rallied around her, offering support, but the wound ran deep. She struggled to reconcile the man she had loved with the monster he truly was. For 58 years, she had trusted him completely. Now she was forced to face the devastating truth alone. As days turned into weeks, the search for Walter continued. Agencies issued bulletins and alerts across state lines, but the trail grew colder. Some believed he might have fled the country, others feared he had taken his own life. Despite extensive efforts, no definitive leads emerged. The man who had hidden his crimes for decades had vanished once again, leaving behind a legacy of fear and unanswered questions. The community of Maple Glen was left forever changed. The quiet streets and friendly faces masked a dark history that no one could have imagined. Walter Hunley, the decorated veteran, the family man, was gone, but the secrets he buried would haunt the town for years to come. The FBI's investigation had revealed a story of deception, murder, and a life built on lies, and yet the final chapter remained unwritten. Months passed since Walter Hunley disappeared, and the case remained open but unsolved. The FBI's search for Charles Emery Doyle had gone cold, leaving behind a trail of questions.